Welcome to the Pot of Inquiry, everyone. Today I am reprising an episode that I did with Dr. Dale Bredesen. Dr. Bredesen is a very renowned neurologist that wrote a very seminal text, probably about 2017, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, and it is called The End of Alzheimer's. It was a very impactful book for me when I read it because we have friends and family members that are and have suffered from cognitive decline. It is a very hot topic now because there are so many people affected by Alzheimer's disease, and frankly, the old paradigm just isn't any good anymore. So if you haven't listened to the episode before, and maybe even if you have, you probably should really dial into this one because it is filled with factual and very important information that could change the lives and save the cognitive lives of your friends and loved ones. So please enjoy this conversation that I had with Dr. Dale Bredesen.
Welcome to the Pot of Inquiry. Ready for some thought-provoking cerebral whipping and the destruction of ridiculous medical dogma? Want to shift those stale, moldy old paradigms? Well then, don that thinking cap of yours, get down in the cave, and join our host, Dr. Stephen Barrett, for this week's episode. Let's start spelunking.
Dr. Dale Bredesen, thank you for joining us on the Pot of Inquiry. I've been a fan of your work for, I guess, about 7 years now. So thanks for taking the time to come on the show. And
great to talk to you, Steve.
So tell the audience a little bit about your background, because one of the things that I found very fascinating is that you're not only a clinician, but you're also a bench scientist. And so I think that's the ultimate in translational medicine.
Yeah, thanks. So I ran a lab for 30 years. So I came through a very classical background, went to Caltech, worked at MIT, then went off to medical school at Duke, and did my internal medicine at Duke, and then did my neurology at UCSF, worked for 2 different Nobel laureates, and trained in neuroscience of degenerative disease. And so I was very interested in why is it, if you look at neurodegenerative disease, this is the area of greatest biomedical therapeutic failure. As people say, everyone knows a cancer survivor. No one knows an Alzheimer's survivor. And that's rapidly changing, of course. But when I was training, there was just absolutely nothing. And part of the problem was that it seemed that nobody agreed on what actually caused the problem of neurodegeneration. So we've made a lot of strides over the last 30 years in understanding what actually drives this process.
Well, I want to tell the audience that they need to get your book if they don't already have it, because I think it's really a great compendium of all things especially the neurophysiology that you talk about. And I wanted to dive into that. In chapter 5, which I love the title because it's titled From Bedside to Bench and Back. And I think that one of the things that is so special about what you have done and continue to do is that you're able to go into the laboratory and then you're able to take it and work in the clinic and see the patients and the response. And that gives somebody a perspective, in my opinion, that you cannot get if you're just on one side of the fence or the other side of the fence.
Yeah, it's a great point. And so what's interesting to me is what happens at the bedside really informs what you do at the bench, and what you get at the bench tells you what to go back. So you can kind of go back and forth. And that is really a powerful way to develop a translational program that begins to help people that really could never be helped before.
Right. Now, in 1994, I think it was, is when you were starting to figure out that you could grow neurological tissue and neurons in culture, and you took that from glioblastomas and gliomas, and prior to that, that wasn't able to be done, right?
Well, no, actually, about 100 years ago, people began to grow in dish. Dr. Ross, and I'm trying to remember his original experiments, but he was showing that you could grow cells in a dish. What we did was to model the diseases in a dish. So at the time, when I was training, I was so excited about the cancer researchers because they had a model where you could take a cancer out of a human being, grow it in a dish, treat it with various things, study the mutations, et cetera. And then you could even put it in a mouse, a nude mouse that wasn't going to reject it, and study it there. So they had a beautiful system to make a difficult problem relatively simple in a dish. So my goal when I set up my lab was to set up the first systems whereby we could do just what you're saying. We could actually take a model of a degenerative disease in a dish, and there hadn't been any such models. And what we found was really interesting, that when you take the various genes that are associated with neurodegeneration, a mutation in APP for Alzheimer's, a mutation in copper zinc SOD for ALS, for example, you now put those into the cells in the dish. What happens is the cells gain a new property, which is that they are highly sensitive to committing suicide. So if you just tweak them with anything, you take away their serum briefly, you get rid of their trophic factors, you hit them with a toxin a little bit, they will die more quickly than the ones that have the normal gene in there. So it really told us, here is a property of neurodegeneration, just as people had found a property of cancer, that it changes things like your ability to interact with other cells and things like that. So I thought, great, this is just what we're looking for, some way to study the phenomenon in a dish. And now we can start looking at what things change that.
So can you go into a little bit about amyloid beta and the amyloid beta, or the precursor protein, and kind of explain that physiology? Because I think that's so fascinating.
Yeah, so that's turned out to be a very interesting switch. But let me step back just to give a little bit of background here, because this has turned out to be such a fascinating area overall. So what happens, during our evolution, as you know, evolution selects for performance over durability. And this has been known for years. And in fact, the idea of aging comes from this selection. So you select for performance over durability. You're always trying to outcompete your foes and your food, right? You're trying to get ahead.
Right.
And so in so doing, you create what's called antagonistic pleiotropy. What that means is our aging is related to the fact that we have selected things that give us performance, and we've lost some durability over time. So what we discovered is that the same thing happens in the nervous system. So it's kind of amazing. We have these unbelievable nervous systems. You can store in your brain about as much information as you can store in 2,000 to 3,000 home computers. About as much as you have in the largest supercomputers in the world. So you have a tremendous amount you can do inside your skull. You're selecting for this. And what happens when you do this is you lose some of the durability. Similarly, so you have a neuroplasticity network, which is begun to be lost in Alzheimer's. You have a motor modulation network, which is lost in Parkinson's. And we know in that case what the Achilles heel is. It's mitochondrial complex 1. And then you have a motor power. It's incredible. When you stomp on your accelerator and get that huge burst of power, that fold difference is about 10,000-fold or so. You actually have a little more of that when you go from a thought to say, okay, I'm going to activate my muscles, and you have the maximal activation of your muscles. It's incredible. So you have these amazingly evolutionarily tuned systems that have Achilles heels when it comes to durability. And in the case of Alzheimer's and neuroplasticity, as you mentioned, APP is a fascinating switch. So this is amyloid precursor protein, and it sits in membranes, especially at synapses, more in neurons than in non-neuronal tissue. And what happens is it gets cut in one of two different ways. When things are good, when you've got plenty of support, you've got trophic support, you've got nutritional support, hormonal support, interaction with extracellular matrix support, not too much inflammation or toxicity. It is cut at a single site, which is the alpha site, that gives you those two peptides, SAPP alpha and alpha C-terminal fragments, CTF. And one's for outside, one's for inside. And they literally send signals to your brain saying things are good, grow, et cetera. And so what we realized, you literally have two modes, just like you have sleep and awake.
Right.
You have connection and protection. So the alpha site, that's the connection side. You make memories, you store them. On the other hand, the same molecule When you have insults, when there's too much inflammation, not enough energetic support, too much toxicity, it is cut at 3 sites. Now you have 4 peptides, and interestingly, one of them is the amyloid that has been vilified in Alzheimer's. What it's really doing is it's telling you you've got insults. You're responding to these insults. So you now have this response where you've got 2 for outside, 2 for inside, and these things are saying we're shifting our resources from connection to protection. So the amyloid itself is a wonderful antimicrobial peptide, as pointed out years ago by Doctors Robert Moyer and Rudy Tanzi from Harvard. So really interesting work. And so you are literally switching that mode from connection to protection. And now you are pulling back. It's very much what we saw in our country when we had the beginning of the pandemic. Everyone said shelter in place, socially distance, don't go into work. And of course, we went into a recession. That's what your brain is doing. It's pulling back, it's switching its resources from connection to protection. So when we studied those, we studied that phenomenon. We realized you can literally trace molecular pathways. You can show, for example, when you add estradiol, you go toward the connection side. When you activate NF-kappa B with inflammation, you go to the protection side. So it's a beautiful system. And actually, APP interacts with dozens of other proteins to basically tell you, where do we stand, and are we going this way or that way? You can also show that ApoE4, very interesting, and this is, of course, the most common genetic risk for Alzheimer's. About 75 million Americans have a single copy, and about 7 million Americans are homozygous, have two copies for ApoE4, and that increases the risk dramatically. And this is a pro-inflammatory gene, so it's moving you more, it's more rapid and more sustained to move you toward the protection side. And you can actually even see it interacts and enters the nucleus and alters the transcription of 1,700 different genes. That was we published that several years ago. This is the work of Dr. Ram Rao with my colleague in the laboratory. So there is a beautiful story of connectivity. And this is now even related to brain development and plasticity. As you probably know, Relin is a molecule it's emerged recently as being very important. Relin levels, when they drop low, are associated with Alzheimer's. So Relin is a protease that is involved in the extracellular matrix and is involved in cell migration. So it is allowing, again, that plasticity. When you're developing your brain, it's involved in the movement of the cells, but after it's developed, it's now involved in making the synapses, in the movement of the neurites. So when you've got low levels of this, you don't have that same ability to make those synaptic connections. So it's a beautiful story. In fact, it's even involved with things like autism and ADHD. Autism, you have actually got too much of the SAPP alpha side. You've got essentially too tight connections, which is why people are like, leave me alone. Don't, it's too much. Everything's overstimulated. Whereas with ADHD, you're on the other side, and you're banging on things because you don't have the input that you'd like. So the whole thing tells you a lot about neuroplasticity, how you get a disease that's associated with neuroplasticity, and how to prevent it and reverse it.
So help me out here a little bit, because you point out in the chapter that you have this cleavage. It's either cleaved into 2 proteins, which is good, or 4 proteins, which is synaptoclastic, as you lay out. It's bad. But then one of those 4 is the amyloid beta itself, and then it circles back in like a feedback cycle to promote more of the same. So you get this accumulation of amyloid beta. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's such a good point. So here's what happens. When you have a single goal outcome in a biological system, so your serum pH, you want it to be 7.4, you never want it to be 10.4 or 2.4. So you have homeostatic feedback. If you drink a soda and it gets more acidic, you're going to change both respiratory and serum compensation for this, and you're going to drive yourself back. Metabolic compensation as well. And so you're going to drive this back to 7.4. Now, interestingly, what people don't talk about enough is when you have a multi-goal outcome, literally it's like a switch. So you're going to sometimes be here, sometimes there, but you don't really want to be sitting in the middle. You're going to flip the switch this way or you're going to flip it that way, which is what APP does. Then
Right.
you got a multi-goal outcome and you require amplification. And a good example is blood clotting. You have a system of serine proteases that have positive feedback, not homeostatic feedback. So you tend toward, I'm going to have a more clotting because I need to clot right now because I just cut myself, or now I'm going to not clot so much. And of course, when you get that runaway, that is DIC, that's disseminated intravascular coagulation. That's the problem.
Right.
Same idea here. This is a system where you're making and you're breaking synapses. You're going forward or back. And by the way, that's why when you look at phospho-tau, which, as you know, has emerged as a wonderful blood test, it's going to change the world in terms of understanding very early stages of Alzheimer's and being able to prevent virtually everybody from getting dementia. So that's part of the pulling back, the synaptoclastic, as you mentioned. So what happens here, because this is a switch type system, there is positive feedback. Now you're going to go forward. So now you're going to feedback. What happens is if you are pulling back, you're making that amyloid. It is part of a response to insults. It's an antimicrobial peptide, as is tau. And this thing is now out there searching and killing the insult that just came to you. And so what happens, it has a prionic loop. And we believe that that is the origin of prions. Of course, Dr. Stanley Prusiner, who was my mentor when I was a postdoctoral fellow, won the Nobel Prize for his discovery and characterization of prions. And we believe that this is part of biological signal amplification. So what happens is the A beta, as you said, it feeds back and it prevents that alpha cleavage that would be on the side of the connectivity. So it keeps you moving toward the protection mode. So you're essentially going to flip that switch until you take care of the insult, until, again, just like your immune system, you're activating it until you take care and you clear the pathogen. Now you can reset. So that's why you have these prionic loops. These are associated with ramping up a system that needs to quickly go into gear to fight these various microbes.
So let me ask you, with the different genetic components, the ApoE4s, whether it's a single allele or two, or APO3, does that affect the neurons in their de novo production of the APP that subsequently then goes into all of what you just laid out?
Yeah. So it's if you look at an ApoE4, for example, it interacts with REL-A, which is part, of course, associated with inflammation. It enters the nucleus and it alters 1,700 different genes. So it sits on 1,700 different gene promoters. And actually, when we first discovered that, that was controversial. People said, "Wait, what are you talking about? ApoE, what's it doing in the nucleus?" But others have now confirmed this, shown the same thing. And in fact, it interacts with DNA at a low nanomolar affinity. So it's very much like transcription factors. So it has a very high affinity for DNA, and it's got multiple arginines, positive charges, that allow it to interact with the negative charges on the DNA. So when you do that, it is now pushing you more in general. Now, what we found is that there's actually an interesting loop. So it gets modified. There's a post-translational modification that occurs with ApoE4, and so it can go on and off the DNA. And so when it's on the DNA, you have a more pro-inflammatory state. So in that sense, yes, it is pushing your APP to spend more time in the A beta side. And that's been known for years, that the outcome of that, the fact that you do have more A beta in people who are ApoE4 positive. And now we understand why. It is having that pro-inflammatory. Now, what's good is if you're living in a third world country, and this has been studied in Ghana, it's been studied in Bolivia and the Chimane Indians, you do better if you're ApoE4 positive, because you're living in a situation where there are a lot of insult and there are a lot of things, and you do better than your ApoE3 brethren. So ApoE4, was the primordial allele.
Before we continue with this great discussion, I just want to take a quick break to acknowledge this week's sponsor. I'm constantly exploring new avenues to enhance well-being and address any health concerns. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce you to an exciting supplement called STEM Regen, which I take daily and genuinely believe could revolutionize your health journey as well. STEM Regen stands out as a game changer in the realm of wellness. Crafted from 5 potent plant extracts, it boasts a remarkable ability to stimulate the release of your body's own stem cells from your red bone marrow. Why is this significant? Well, stem cells are the superheroes of our body's natural repair system. They possess the extraordinary capacity to morph into various cell types, aiding in tissue regeneration and repair. As we age, the quantity of circulating stem cells in our system reduces significantly, impairing our body's ability to heal and rejuvenate itself effectively. STEM Regen steps in to counter this decline by kickstarting the release of stem cells into circulation, thereby bolstering your body's innate repair mechanisms. Once unleashed into your bloodstream, these mobilized stem cells actively seek out areas of damage or injury, initiating the healing process. By incorporating STEM Regen into your daily routine, you're essentially empowering your body to tap into its own regenerative prowess more efficiently. I firmly believe that STEM Regen could be a valuable addition to your wellness regimen, especially if you're seeking to fortify overall health and vitality, accelerate tissue repair, or expedite recovery from injury or illness. This first of its kind stem cell mobilizer is changing the game in regenerative medicine. Don't wait to unleash your body's innate healing capabilities. Visit stemregen.co/Dr. Steven, that's with a PH, and use the code SBPOD to get a 15% discount off your first order of STEM Regen.
And for 96% of our evolution as hominids, we've all been ApoE44, all homozygous. It's just in the last 220,000 years that ApoE3 appeared, and then just in the last 80,000 years that ApoE2 appeared. And ApoE3 is the common one now. Right. And so we look at risk as compared to the ApoE3/3s. And the risk for a 3/3 is about 9% over your lifetime. If you have a single copy of ApoE4, you're talking about 30%. Right. And a paper just came out a couple weeks ago saying that if you are ApoE44, you are at 90% risk.
Wow.
So you have a huge risk. Their argument was essentially they argue that it's more like a familial Alzheimer's case. We disagree with that because they're looking only at people who aren't doing any sort of prevention or anything.
Right.
There are lots of people on a website started by Julie G that's called apoe4.info. And she herself is a 4/4 who had symptoms in her late 40s. She's now in her early 60s and doing absolutely great. She got on the protocol and she's continued to tweak that over the years, and she's doing very, very well.
Now, let me step back a little bit because you've laid that out very well. And then you were able to test in vitro different agents, or like you said, maybe just a slight nutritional change that would tip the scale into the cellular suicide mode.
Right.
And so you've actually been able to test many different agents, correct?
Right. So what we did is we set up that model years ago, and then what we started to do is say, okay, what perturbs that? So we looked at genetics, what things change that. We looked at protein interactions. For example, we found that the molecule that binds nerve growth factor, P75, is an interactor there. We looked at the signaling downstream. How does this work? And then we started to look at, okay, what drugs change this? And this is actually what really started our protocol. So we started by screening all of the approved drugs. There's a panel of a few thousand drugs. And we screened all those to say, are there things out there already that could push you from the protection side to the connection side. We wanted to get less A beta and more of the SAPP alpha. As we did that, we fairly quickly came up with a couple of interesting ones. And one interesting one is called tropicitron, which is already out. It's used in 39 different countries, unfortunately not in the US, but it's used, for example, in Australia. It is an antiemetic. So they give it to people to prevent nausea and vomiting when they have chemotherapy. And it very nicely will switch you back to the connection mode. And so then we wanted to know, well, okay, what does that mean for treatment? And so we started to set up the first trial, and this was way back in 2011. And as we set up the trial, I was sitting there in front of the big whiteboard in my office and like all the things for our trial that we're going to do. And we had raised a few $1 million actually for this trial. I was very grateful to the philanthropist. This actually came from the Bechtel Foundation, and I really appreciated Mr. Stephen Bechtel. Met with him and with his foundation, very, very enthusiastic. However, as we looked at this, we thought, well, wait a minute, tricking the brain is not the answer here. Just taking a system that is trying to protect itself and saying, no, we're not going to let you protect yourself. We're going to force you to try to connect. It's a little bit like saying, there's a killer out in your neighborhood, so you should stay inside. Like, no, you're going to go ahead and walk outside anyway. Well, that could be a problem. You're not going to be responding to your insults as well. So as we were setting up the trial, I thought, okay, what we should do is start to add other pieces. I thought, what's the chance of one drug doing this? This is a complex network we're defining, and we've got to really look at how this works. So we started looking at, okay, can we add some brain training? Can we add exercise? Can we improve sleep? And then we realized, wait a minute, why would we leave any of these things out? And it kind of a light bulb went off in 2011. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. We need to create the right situation for the entire system, the network, to flip back into this connection mode and not have to be in the protection mode. And again, this is where people have gotten this so wrong. They're saying, well, just rip out the amyloid that's there and everything's going to be okay. That makes no sense.
Right.
It's there because you are responding to these insults. Now, you might get lucky in a few people and the insult has gone away and it's just sitting there with the amyloid, and now you're going to, okay, then there might get a few people. But as you know, the trials have shown it. When you rip the amyloid out, you don't get people to be better. You may slow their decline a little bit. That's what's been shown in the trials. Right. And in so doing, you're ripping it out of the vessels, which is one of the places it sits. And of course, the vessels leak. When you rip this out, it's like taking a patch off a tire.
Right.
So it's really a barbaric and kind of 1990s way of thinking to just rip the amyloid out of your brain. To be fair, it is acting like a long-acting cytokine. So the idea of, okay, we're quelling the inflammation. Well, okay, but why is the inflammation there? So what we want to do is we want to resolve that inflammation. We want to reset the system, but we also want to remove the insults that are giving you that problem. And so you have to look, again, this is a new way to think about these diseases. Instead of just one pharmaceutical agent, you want to look at the network. And with AI and with the emergence of large data sets and algorithmic medicine, this is exactly the way medicine should be done, looking at entire networks as opposed to one thing where you get you might get a short-term slight improvement and you're just doing it to sell drugs. Let's go with what's optimal for the patients, which is, by the way, personalized. Some people will have specific pathogens. Some people will have specific toxins. You need to go after those for each person.
Well, I think this is a good segue into a couple of things. One is that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there have been a fair amount of autopsy studies where they've found very high levels of amyloid beta in people that had no cognitive impairment whatsoever. And that, it's always been one drug, one disease, or one disease, one drug. And then you talk about precision medicine. and
Yes.
looking at everything. I mean, I have multiple questions on just that, but I mean, I looked it up. There was $3.7 billion spent in 2023 by the NIH for Alzheimer's research.
Yep.
How much of that has gone into what you're doing versus trying to find the silver magic bullet?
None.
Yeah.
Oh,
Isn't that
It's
incredible?
Yep, it is. Now
Yeah.
people are putting their toe in the water and saying, well, what if we just did exercise, or what if we just did this? So they're not saying, look, we really have to change. And I get this. This is the history of medicine.
Right.
You have a system that's set up to go in this direction, and then you realize, oh wait, we really have to make a paradigm shift. And they'll say, well, now we're going to go in this direction because there's a whole infrastructure. The people who are reviewing the grants don't want to do this other new thing. So what you have, well, some people say there's the finger trial came out of Finland where they did 4 things. But it was a uniform, it's not personalized. They took people who were at high vascular risk and they saw some improvement. But again, they're kind of just beginning to think about this. The reality is we need to take an entirely new view, an entirely new approach. We need to define all these parameters. It's going to be 10 or 20 years before the NIH, embraces this sort of thing, because, the people who are reviewing the grants are not ready for this yet, unfortunately. So
Right.
it's going to go on outside the classical pathways for a while, and we're in the middle of a randomized controlled trial at 6 sites. This is the history of medicine. If you look back at what happened with scurvy, in the 1600s, people started to understand it. Then the doctor said, no, that's not what it was. 1700s, thousands and thousands of people died needlessly from scurvy before the doctors finally wrapped their heads around it, only in the 20th century.
Wow.
Now scurvy is rare. But it's sad to see that there are such impediments to changing the way we think about these diseases, when clearly the data show people do much better with a precision medicine approach, just as you said.
Well, and that's not just in neurocognitive disease, that's in virtually all chronic disease. Absolutely. So you mentioned in your book that your wife was into functional medicine and your training, I'll bet, you never heard the word ashwagandha at Caltech or Duke, right? And so I was wondering, what kind of influence did she have when you're doing this lab work and you're starting to look at this and you put together your great analogy of the 36 holes in the roof and then leading into the RECODE program. So tell me a little bit about how that shaped your thought processes, because she had to have some influence on you, I would think.
So it was so funny because here I'm married to a functional medicine doctor who we're doing these highly reductionistic experiments over the years in the lab. We're looking at what if you make a point mutation in APP? What if you make a point mutation in P75? All this sort of stuff. And she's telling me, we're sitting at dinner and she's saying, well, whatever you guys find in the lab, it's going to have something to do with how you sleep and how you eat and the basics. And I said to her, no. We're going to find one fold of one protein. We're going to develop a drug against that one fold, and we're going to cure this disease. So then what happened, as we're studying all this, we're seeing, here are all the things that APP interacts with. In fact, people had said, A beta is just sticky. It just interacts with everything. Well, yeah, in some sense it is, but now we understand more why. So now we're seeing that how this beautiful network starts to come together. And I'm starting to think, wait a minute, this does have to do with things like exercise and inflammation, especially. These are drivers and energetics, trophic activity. I'm like, So I'm looking over at her, I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's a whole world of this functional medicine. And so we're now saying, okay, what could we do to drive that APP into the correct signaling, into the connection again, getting rid of the insults? Okay, now we're seeing we can start. So what happened, we would have had to kind of start from nothing. And if this world that Jeffrey Bland and his colleagues started, 25 years ago or so. So we started meeting with Jeffrey and like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, so now we can use these tools. And the thing that's amazing, we've been told over the years that the armamentarium for Alzheimer's is zero. There's nothing, in fact, it's specifically said on the Alzheimer's Association website, there is nothing that will prevent, reverse, or delay Alzheimer's. Well, that turns out to be completely wrong. There's a huge and growing armamentarium. So the good news is you need to know how to use each of them. There are hundreds and hundreds of things. What do you want to do? So the cool thing is that these things fit into our model, the molecular model of Alzheimer's, perfectly. So, okay, you can pull in ashwagandha. It does make it reduces it will actually pick up the amyloid better. It's reducing that inflammation. It's improving your sleep, which is helpful. Great. We can now bring in things. If you're under stress, we can bring in rhodiola. If you need more BDNF, we can bring in whole coffee fruit extract. So the molecular pathways that we were playing with for all those years in the lab, they now fit perfectly into a functional medicine world where they're looking at the upstream causes, as they say, root cause of disease. Suddenly, it made perfect sense. These things can come together. We now have hundreds and hundreds of things. So there is a time for exercise with oxygen therapy, EWAT, improving blood flow, improving oxygenation. We want to check to see if you have sleep apnea. That's one of the things that drives you toward Alzheimer's. We want to see if your oral microbiome has changed, because in fact, oral microbiome affects the brain, both directly and indirectly. So now suddenly we can see what's driving that system we had been studying all these years. And we can use the functional medicine approaches to get the appropriate protocol. So now you have a precision protocol that is, it may or may not have ashwagandha. It may have EWAD in it. You may have to treat a tick-borne illness, because that's one of the common ways to get inflammation. And so it's telling us what this disease is all about and what to do about it.
So actually what you're saying is that you have to really listen to the patient, do a very good HPI, do the appropriate testing, and then actually treat them in a multimodal fashion.
Exactly. And you do have to check to see, which unfortunately standard medicine is not doing yet. You have to see, are there chronic infections that haven't been recognized? Is there some reduction of oxygen saturation at night, whether from sleep apnea, UARS, whatever? Are you, interestingly, are you in a mode of fight or flight? And this was a beautiful book that just came out from Dr. Neil Nathan, which is the Sensitive Patients Healing Guide. And it turns out people who have this, literally, again, another mode switch, where you're changing the amygdala, you're changing vagal stimulation, and you're putting yourself into a mode of hypersensitivity to chemicals, to stress, and things like that. You've got to get out of that if you're going to do best with your cognition. And we've just had some spectacular results. I've just been talking to Carrie Rutland, who's a health coach in New York. One of her patients who had posterior cortical atrophy, as she's coming back, as things are getting better, and she ended up having Bartonella, and she ended up having mycotoxin exposure. Again, things that standard of care isn't even looking for in Alzheimer's disease. These are things that are critical to evaluate and critical to address for best outcomes.
Well, the problem is that actually takes work. And when you're seeing 70 patients in a day, you don't have time to really dive into that case and really dig deep, because what you're doing is you're addressing this from so many different ways. But it's really the ultimate of precision medicine. Has the American Alzheimer's Association now recognized your program?
Absolutely not. In fact, they push back quite. They're the ones that are saying we don't like it. They are, of course, they're heavily supported by pharma.
Yeah.
And so in fact, we've even run into trying to get the results. We had a successful clinical trial of our protocol, published that 2 years ago. We try to literally go to a service that normally will put this out on the web. They said, no, we cannot advertise this because we are paid by the drug company that has the competitor for what you're doing, which doesn't give you anything close to as good a results. But they said, we can't risk losing that contract. So there is as you know, there's a schism in medicine today. There's the old-fashioned prescription pad medicine, and then there's 21st century precision medicine. And these two are at odds. And so people tend to practice one or the other. We really need to bring these back together because I think in the long run, combining targeted drugs at the right ones for the right people at the right times with the right mechanisms can be very powerful. In fact, I just saw this sort of thing happening with autism. Autism is now starting. They just reported some positive results in treating autism, and it was doing the same sort of thing that we are doing.
And now a message from our sponsor. I've been taking Nature's Marvels bioregulatory peptides for more than 3 years now on a very consistent basis. It's an integral part into my wellness journey, and I can't imagine not even going on this journey without that. These are designed with cutting-edge science to optimize and restore your body's natural processes. After 3 years, I can say without a doubt, this isn't another wellness product that just gets pushed to the back of the cabinet. This is the real deal for human optimization and longevity. Start your journey today with Nature's Marvels. Our website's below.
It's a little tangential, but what do you think? I mean, the incidence of autism has just skyrocketed over the last 30, 35 years. Is there something that you can put your thumb on that you think that you would hypothesize that there's a reason for that?
That's so interesting because what else has skyrocketed? Alzheimer's in young people. So there was an epidemiological study just a couple of years showing the greatest increases are in the 30-somethings, 40-somethings, and 50-somethings. When I was training, we never saw people. We thought of this as a disease of your 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Now know that it starts biochemically about 20 years before a diagnosis. So it's a great question. And I do think that if you look at the molecular pathways, what is driving these things is the same thing that is driving childhood obesity, same thing that's driving leptin resistance. So you have a combination of ultra-processed food that is everywhere, that wasn't so ubiquitous in the 60s and 70s, and now it's just everywhere. Insulin resistance and leptin resistance, of course, it goes with it. And then you've got more exposure to toxins than ever before. And you've got people living, as they say, we build our homes of mold food. And so a lot of us are living in mycotoxin-ridden houses.
Right.
And so we've got a toxic world like never before. And the reality is that we have made over the last 150 years, we've made a series of assumptions. It's fine to use high fructose corn syrup. It's fine to make people eat more stuff by putting in more salt, sugar, and fat. It's fine to let the wood that you're going to build your house with get wet, and then don't worry about it, and then just build the house. And all of these have been assumptions that have turned out to be incorrect.
Right.
So we do have to backtrack a little bit. We do have to look more at detox. We do have to look more at insulin resistance. 80 million Americans have a metabolic syndrome. I mean, metabolic syndrome has gone off the rails, as you know.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that these things are related. If you look at autism, what do you see with these people? Number one, they often have messed up guts. So they've got leaky guts and they've got changes in their microbiome that are likely to be important. Number two, they have exposure to toxins. And in fact, when you start to address those toxins and start to heal that gut, they start to get better.
Well, I've read some stuff about oxalates that may have a role and that they put people on really restrictive diets with autism and really try to reduce the oxalates, and they've shown some clinical improvement.
That's interesting because oxalates, of course, have been associated with kidney stones, very, very common. But in Dr. Neil Nathan's book, he points out that what are the things that drive you to this hypersensitive state? Essentially, what's happening is your amygdala, your limbic system is saying, oh my gosh, I've been insulted repeatedly. I'm going to have to go into this protective mode. Again, it's analogous to what we're seeing with Alzheimer's. It goes into this protective mode, which is very hard to get out of. And the initial things he found was exposure to various biotoxins, exposure to tick-borne infections like Borrelia, Bartonella, Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, things like that. But what's interesting is that one of the points he mentions is oxalates can also drive you into that mode. So, again, with autism, it's a brain change, in this case, developmental, not degenerative, that is associated with systemic insults.
Let's shift back to Alzheimer's for a second. And you lay out your RECODE program lays out, I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of different modalities and interventions that you recommend. And then also, I'll preface that with, again, you got to go back to what type of the Alzheimer's disease that they have, and then, adjust. And that's part of the precision medicine aspect. But, and you mentioned glucose and hyperinsulinemia, and I deal with that all of the time in our peripheral neuropathy patients. But what's your thought on SGLT2 inhibitors to drive the glucose down a little bit?
Yeah, it's so interesting. When we were doing our screening for drugs, we came up with some with some drugs that were very similar to that out of our screens, and saying, okay, here's something that's worth looking into. DPP4 inhibitors, interestingly, which have been used for diabetes, came out of this. So there's no question that when you look at all the different things that drive this pathway, insulin resistance and hyperglycemia are among the most common. And so a lot of Alzheimer's has as one of its contributors insulin resistance. Now, what's interesting is that these various, semaglutide and tirzepatide and things like that, these things are giving you longer action of your endogenous insulin, as you know. So they're so successful because they're addressing the very thing that so many of us are doing wrong. So in a perfect world, what I'd love for people to do is actually do the right thing, eat the right way, and you don't need those things. The worry is once you go on these, you go on Ozempic or Wegovy or any of these things. Now you're changing you're changing the thermostat, basically. So now, as long as you're on there, you're going to get a little bit of a burst, but then at some point you're either going to come off, or you're going to run out of money. I mean, that's the other problem. These things are ridiculously expensive, and now you're right back where you started from, or worse.
But the thing, let me interrupt you a second, because I'm not a big fan of the semaglutide because I think, if they come off of it before a year, they're going to gain all the weight back, but they lose muscle mass. I think there's some questions about how it affects the gut microbiome very negatively, because you're basically putting it into a paralysis, so to speak. You're slowing the gut down, so its gut microbiome is going to definitely be affected. But with an SGLT2 inhibitor, I think you're free of that, aren't you? Because it's just blocking the reabsorption of glucose in the urine, and you're just peeing out 95 to 100 milligrams of glucose a day. So even though, I have some patients that are very, very judicious, and they cannot get their fasting insulin down to below 95. Well, that might be able to take it down just a little bit more for them without maybe some of the negative side effects of the semaglutides.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So if you can just urinate out your glucose better. It may be a way to go, as you mentioned, putting glucose in your kidneys and urinating it out when that's really not where it's meant to be. Can be a concern. Do you not ever run into problems with kidney damage? Do you not ever? I know that you do run into infections because you've now got glucose support there.
Yeah. So one of the biggest side effects actually is in females with urinary tract infections because of the higher level of glucose in the urine. But in males, I have not seen really any problem with that at all. But I'm just thinking, and I think you comment in your book that, this is a really hard program. I mean, it's, you're looking at many, many different things that you have to do. And even the most judicious, motivated patient, if they can have maybe a little bit of a biohack to help, might be something to think about.
So here's an example that might be helpful. So, for example, you've got someone where your insulin is trying to keep up with the glucose that you're taking in, and so you get insulin resistance, but you need more insulin than you can make. So, okay, let's imagine then that you took semaglutide or something like that, so you do get this bump. Okay, your endogenous insulin is going to be more at this point. So to some extent, you've got it time. Now, you could, over that next year, you could lose some weight. Now you become more insulin sensitive, and now you wean yourself off it. I could imagine that as part of something that could be helpful.
Right.
And as you said, also the SGLT inhibitors as well. Yeah. So now you're urinating. That one way to get you back to a more normal state. But then when you can, wean yourself off these things. We see the same thing with the cholinesterase inhibitors. So something like Aricept.
Right.
You now don't have enough acetylcholine, which is part of Alzheimer's disease. So you're now going to prevent the breakdown. Well, okay, so you get a little bump in that, and you may get a little bump. Interestingly, studies have shown that over the next 2 to 5 years, you're actually doing worse than people who didn't go on those drugs. Which is unfortunate, but you can get a little bump, but then you can't cold turkey it. We have people who cold turkey it, and they actually get much worse because what happens when you inhibit cholinesterase, your body just responds by making still more cholinesterase to respond to that. So again, the more you can adhere to normal physiology, the better off you are for a long-term solution. And by the way, we have a paper. It's posted, so you can see it freely online, but it's in review for publication as well. And it will show that we have people for over a decade with sustained improvement, which in Alzheimer's disease is unheard of.
Right.
Someone to improve and then keep their improvement for over a decade. But it's because they have improved their underlying physiology. So their synaptoblastic signaling is doing well. And they can move back to the connection mode and out of the protection mode. And as you mentioned, the approach we take does have some complexity to it because the system is complex.
Right.
We are trying to make it simpler and simpler. And there may be, again, things like combining some of these various drugs as well. But it comes down to 7 basics: diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training, detox, and some targeted supplements. And then the specifics for the precision part. Okay, who has an infection from A, B, C? I mean, there are dozens of infections that can increase risk for Alzheimer's. Toxins. There are hundreds of toxins that can increase risk for Alzheimer's, starting with things like air pollution and mercury and trichothecenes and things like this. So again, this is the future, to be able to just get very simply, you're going to be able to get a lot of these things over the internet. We just started a program literally yesterday where now in 47 states, everywhere but New York, Hawaii, and Alaska, and these will come online in the next few months, you can get 3 tests together. You can do it with mobile phlebotomy. You can just literally go online, getabrainscan.com, and you can get this. And we are working with NeuroCode that actually performs these tests, Dr. Hans Frickman. And these will tell you, is your p-tau 217 already a little high? Is your GFAP, which is responding to these insults, already a little high? It's just as when people first started looking at hemoglobin A1C. You don't have to wait to get diabetes. You can see it at a pre-diabetic stage. And of course, then moving to insulin, you can see pre-diabetes with insulin resistance. Nobody ever has to go all the way to diabetes.
Right.
At least the vast majority of people can avoid it. Same thing with Alzheimer's now. We should all know our p-tau 217 and make sure we never get dementia.
That's a great point. I hope that you'll give me that link. I can put it in the show notes because we have people reach out all the time. How do we get this stuff? And I was going to ask you, have you replicated? I mean, obviously you can't see every patient that needs to have the RECODE program. Have you got an army of disciples out now in the states that are following your program where people can kind of get plugged into that?
Yes, absolutely. So we've trained over 2,000 physicians in 10 different countries and all over the U.S. And so they are evaluating people this way. There is an independent trial. One of the first people who was trained was Dr. Heather Sanderson, who just put out her book called Reversing Alzheimer's, based on the protocol that she learned in the training here. and she's gotten very good results. She had her own trial and got virtually identical results to the ones from our trial. These are proof of concept, small trials just to show, yes, you can do this. But, I go back to compassionate use. We as physicians learn about compassionate use, that when you have something that's not yet accepted by mainstream medicine, but it seems to do, it allows you hope where there otherwise is none, then you really have to make these sorts of things available, which is why we didn't wait for, a huge multi-pronged trial. We say, hey, this is something that's actually helping a lot of people. Let's make it available. And I go back to the work from Dr. Dana-Farber years ago. So it was early 60s, where people were, there was absolutely nothing at that time for childhood leukemia. And he noticed, as a pathologist, by the way, that people who had taken folate actually often did worse with their childhood leukemia. Here's a disease that's untreatable. So he said, okay, what if we have anti-folate, so they started treating, and he reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, the 6 first patients, 2 of them, as he pointed out, the treatment probably killed them. They died rapidly. 2 of the other ones didn't do particularly well, but 2 of them did have a remission, did seem better with this anti-folate. And that became the beginning of what is now very successful treatment. There are many, many examples of people who survive childhood leukemia. In fact, it's very common now to survive childhood leukemia, starting with the work of Dana-Farber. So we see this as very much the same, where it's a different way to look at the disease, it's a different way to treat, but we have many survivors who can tell you, yes, I would have died of Alzheimer's disease, but I'm not in a nursing home, I'm doing very well. Patient 0 that I treated in 2012 just turned 80, and she's doing very well, and working, by the way, as a brain health coach and a yoga instructor. So, she would have likely been either passed away by now or in a nursing home, in a memory care facility. Right. Her mother, by the way, did go through that and died, which is one of the reasons she was so incentivized to do the right things.
Well, I think this really, I think it really is important, like what you said with diabetes, is that you can know you have the propensity, you might not necessarily have the disease. And so, if you have a family history, and I know there's a lot of debate about, well, do I want to do the genetic testing and see if I'm APO4 or APO3? Yeah. My advice would be get the testing, because just because you have a genetic thing doesn't mean the epigenetics are going to manifest in a very horrible way. And you've proven that with what you've done with your research and your RECODE program. So it's,
you bring up such a good point. Mainstream medicine, unfortunately, has everything literally backward when it comes to Alzheimer's, because it's come at it from the point of, we don't know what to do. So don't bother you're checking your ApoE status, because there's nothing you can do anyway. Well, we know there's a lot you can do now. Don't get treated early. Wait till you have, often they'll tell people, you just have mild cognitive impairment, come back next year.
Right.
What a horrible idea. Don't do, preventive checking. So this is really so barbaric. Everybody should find out their ApoE status. And in fact, there's even more genetics. That's just the most common one.
Right.
Find out where you stand. Get on active prevention. We recommend that everybody who's 40 or over, please get a cognoscopy. Just like we know when you turn 50, you get a colonoscopy. If you're 40 or over, please get a cognoscopy. It's simple. You can go online, mycognoscopy.com. It's some blood tests. It's a simple online cognitive test. And if you've already got symptoms, you'll want to include an MRI with volumetrics. But if you don't have symptoms and it's just for prevention, you don't need the MRI. So it's very simple. And that way you can make sure that you never have problems in the future.
Wow. So much. I just want to congratulate you for all the work that you've done. And your ripple effect is almost like a tsunami. So thanks for all of the work that you've done and packaged it into a way that people can access it.
Thanks so much. And thanks for having me on. We'll make it simpler and simpler. But the good news is that there's a tremendous amount that everyone can do. Alzheimer's is rapidly becoming optional.
Oh, that's wonderful. Dr. Dale Bredesen, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Well, folks, if you are over 40 and you are not using a supplement to augment nitric oxide production, you should really rethink that. This molecule is absolutely imperative to the health of so many bodily functions, not the least of which is cardioprotection. If you have any question on nitric oxide, I suggest that you register with Approved Medical Solutions and begin receiving their educational emails. I never miss a day of nitric oxide supplementation. That's how important it is. Long overdue, Approved Medical Solutions created the only nitric oxide replenishment formula without oxalates. Approved Medical Solutions does not use beet, spinach, or arginine. Approved Medical Solutions is proud to offer our audience their oxalate-free nitric oxide formula. If you are not a healthcare provider, you can still get started by going to approvedmedicalsolutions.com and use the code SBARRETT at checkout, and you'll receive a 10% medical discount savings. You can register to receive educational emails without any purchase. For licensed practitioners, you too can go to approvedmedicalsolutions.com and get registered today. They have unique bundles for all of the full-fledged spelunkers of the Pod of Inquiry. Use Pod of Inquiry at checkout after registration. Here's a little secret. If you order their testing strips and test every patient for a few clinic days, you will see every one of them be deficient. When they see this result, they will want you to start them up immediately. Now, thanks to Approved Medical Solutions, you can give them the best care without the worry of oxalates. I hope you all enjoyed today's show and got some truly empowering knowledge out of it. You can always follow up on anything we talked about in the show notes found at our website, podofinquiry.com. If you think you might have tickled just a few neurons inside that cerebral cortex, please spread the word to your friends and colleagues and tell them that they need to get spelunking. Also, if you can take a minute to leave a review on your podcast provider of choice, and especially Apple Podcasts, that would greatly help the show and be so appreciated, provided it's positive. And if not, then just keep your pie hole shut and stay down in that cave. Let's keep spelunking.
This podcast is designed for informational purposes only and does not constitute any medical or surgical consulting advice or imply a development of any physician-patient relationship. The opinions of guests who are featured on the show are not necessarily the opinions of Dr. Barrett or the production team. This podcast is owned solely by Barrett Medical and Surgical Media, LLC. While the show is highly oriented for physicians and healthcare providers, anyone interested in the improvement of human performance and understanding will find this a welcome goblet to sip from, or guzzle. However, no representation or warranties are made in any way whatsoever on this podcast for any products, techniques, or other things discussed. Invited guests are not vetted by the Pod of Inquiry for their qualifications and may have a direct or indirect financial interest in what they present and discuss on the show. The Pod of Inquiry disclaims any responsibility from anything taken from the show and used personally or professionally. It is a responsibility of the listener to perform their own due diligence prior to the implementation of any ideas, products, techniques, or anything talked about on the show.